Let's start this story in a Los Angeles courtroom back in 2009. Standing before the judge, Phil Spector cuts a surreal figure, a slight aging man under a ridiculous giant wig, his eyes darting behind tinted glasses as a jury pronounces him guilty of murder. It was, to say the least, a rather dramatic fall from grace for the reclusive record producer who once reigned over 1960s pop music. 6 years earlier, in the dawn hours of February the 3rd, 2003, Phil Spector's chauffeur had frantically called police from the driveway of Phil's Mock Castle mansion. Inside, actress Lana Clarkson lay slumped dead, a revolver shot through her mouth. Moments before, Spector had emerged, pistol in hand, muttering, "I think I killed somebody." But if you think the story ended here, you'd be a long way from the truth. The murky madness was only just beginning. This is the story of how the man who gave the world walls a sound ended up being locked behind 4 very real walls. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Philip Spector's penchant for melodrama might be traced back to the very start of his life. He was born Harvey Philip Spector on December 26, 1939, and it was a world of sorrow that young Phil entered. He grew up in the Bronx, New York, in a working-class Jewish family. From the outside, the Spectors appeared pretty unremarkable. But when Phil was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. In April 1949, his father, Benjamin Spector, died by suicide. It seems the act was driven by deep debt and private despair. On Ben Spector's gravestone, the bereaved family had inscribed a haunting epitaph. To know him was to love him. These words, carved in stone over a father's grave, would echo eerily through Phil's life, and of course became the title of his first hit song. In the wake of the suicide, Phil's mother, Bertha, moved Phil and his older sister across the country to Los Angeles in 1953. The cross-continental transplant uprooted young Phil from the crowded streets of New York to the optimistic and sun-soaked promise of post-war California. By his teens, Spector was attending Fairfax High School in LA, a campus that also incubated other future music legends, like producer Lou Adler, drummer Sandy Nelson, and Bruce Johnson of the Beach Boys. Socially, he was often described as quiet and awkward. He was a short, slight boy with a love of music that far outsized him. Perhaps to compensate for childhood wounds or insecurities, Phil poured himself into mastering the guitar and piano. His identity would form through music above anything else, and he was going to places with it that others could merely dream of. The shy kid from the Bronx had a chip on his shoulder and something to prove. In 1958, at 18, Spector found a way to alchemize his pain into pop gold. He formed a doo-wop group, cheekily named the Teddy Bears. It consisted of Phil, Marshall Lieb, Harvey Goldstein, Sandy Nelson, and Annette Kleinbard, who would later change her name and become famous as singer Carol Connors. They rehearsed in garages and living rooms, and Phil emerged as their songwriter. Drawing on the words on his father's tombstone, he wrote a tender ballad titled "To Know Him Is to Love Him." He became completely obsessed with the song and led the group into Gold Star Studios in Hollywood to lay down the track, along with another song, "Don't You Worry My Little Pet." The session cost $75. And Phil had already been hanging out at the studio to learn production techniques. It would be a very shrewd investment, as the return on the first track in particular would be enormous. This mournful homage evidently struck a universal chord. In late 1958, "To Know Him Is to Love Him" rocketed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it would sell over 1 million copies worldwide. Suddenly, the teenage Spector was thrust into the spotlight, a one-hit wonder still in high school. and he was grappling with fame fueled by his ongoing grief about his father. As he would later say, he went from Phil Who to a pop prodigy practically overnight. The Teddy Bears never replicated that first success. Bickering and the fickleness of the charts saw the group quit by 1959 after their only album, The Teddy Bears Sing, bombed in the charts. But Phil had gotten his first addictive taste of the music business, and he was hooked. Rather than chase another novelty hit as a performer, Phil started to move toward the control room where the real power resided. He briefly enrolled in college in California, but the pull of music was stronger than schooling. Phil had met Lester Sill while making the Teddy Bears LP. Sill was a veteran music publisher and mentor to top songwriters Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller. He was impressed by the youngster's talent and perhaps his chutzpah. So Sill took Spector under his wing. In 1960, Sill set him up with an apprenticeship in New York with Leiber and Stoller, the legendary writers behind Elvis Presley and the Coasters. The New York trip really opened Spector's eyes to studio craft. He co-wrote Spanish Harlem, a lush Benny King hit in 1960, Phil's first taste of the top 10 beyond the Teddy Bears, and even played guitar on the Drifters' classic On Broadway. A quick learner, Phil absorbed techniques from these masters of R&B production. But he was also formulating his own ideas, visions of a grander, more symphonic style of pop that would soon reshape the sound of the era. Now, with a few songwriting credits and a reputation for quality work, the 20-year-old returned to Los Angeles hungry to make his mark behind the console. In 1961, Phil took a big risk. He co-founded his very own record label, Phil Les Records, with partner Lester Sill. At age 21, Phil became the youngest ever American label owner, a fact he evidently relished, and the press reported on with no little astonishment. The label's name combined Phil and Les for Lester, but it quickly became clear who was in charge. He got the nickname, the first tycoon of teen. And it's true that Phil had a knack for spotting hit material that would sell to teenagers. He also had an obsessive desire to control every aspect of the music-making process. In an industry then dominated by men in their 50s and 60s, this baby-faced upstart stormed in and started churning out chart toppers. One of Phil Les Records' earliest signings was the Crystals, a young vocal group for whom Phil produced There's No Other Like My Baby, and then He's a Rebel. In 1962, He's a Rebel, a catchy tune about bad boy love, flew to #1 on the charts. Although it was credited to the Crystals, Phil had in fact hurriedly recorded it with another singer, Darlene Love, and her group, The Blossoms, putting it out under the Crystals' name so he could cut ahead of rival Liberty Records, who were lining up a release of the song for Vicky Carr. This kind of ruthless business acumen would pair well with his magical ear for hit songs when it came to building his empire. With the success of He's a Rebel, the Spector train had left the station. Phil Les became a hit factory and Phil its mercurial foreman, churning out singles by groups like Bobby Sox and the Blue Jeans, also featuring vocalist Darlene Love, and, most famously, the Ronettes. It was in these years that Spector pioneered his most famous creation, the wall of sound. He had been frustrated by the thinness of typical pop recording, so he began amassing large numbers of musicians in the studio to play in unison. This created a roar of overlapping tones that, when captured in mono, had the depth and richness of a symphony. Multiple guitars strumming the same chords, pianos pounding in octaves, horns, strings and percussion all layered lavishly. Every sonic space was filled and then drenched in reverb. Phil likened his wall of sound teenage melodramas to Wagnerian operas for pop music, calling them little symphonies for the kids. The effect was unmistakable. Once you heard a Phil Spector production, other records suddenly sounded weak and thin. In 1963, he co-wrote and produced Be My Baby for the Ronettes. The band was led by a young singer named Veronica Ronnie Bennett. With its thunderous dum-da-dum boom-boom drum intro and glorious oral hurricane, Be My Baby became a defining song of the era, and in fairness of Phil's entire career. The opening drums alone would still send shivers down the spine of everyone from Brian Wilson to moviegoers watching Dirty Dancing decades later. He had similar chart magic with the Crystals' Da-Do Ron Ron and Then He Kissed Me, and Darlene Love's Christmas classic Baby Please Come Home. By late 1964, Spector had placed over a dozen records in the US Top 40 and 3 at number 1, all of them stamped with his sonic trademark. He was not just producing songs, he was, as critics would later say, essentially producing himself. Each record was an auteur's statement, unmistakably a Phil Spector record, no matter who the artist was. Behind the scenes, the boy wonder had become something of a tyrant in the studio, albeit a brilliant one, wearing his Napoleon complex like a chest full of medals. Phil demanded absolute and total control. Musicians who worked his sessions, a legendary cohort of LA session players later nicknamed the Wrecking Crew, were expected to leave their egos at the door and sometimes play the same 4-bar riff for hours on end until the boss was satisfied. He could be alternately charming and ferociously foul-mouthed, cajoling the best out of singers with praise 1 minute, then exploding in profanity the next, when a take didn't meet his exacting standards. Phil's perfectionism was an obsession. One engineer recalled him spending 3 hours tinkering with the placement of a single microphone. But the results spoke for themselves. Tracks like You've Lost That Loving Feeling by the Righteous Brothers, produced by Spector in 1964, showed the increasing power and artistry of Phil's sound. To call this song a hit would be an insult. It was an atomic blast of 45 RPM success. Lovin' Feelin' hit number 1 in 1965, and amazingly would go on to become the most played song on American radio in the entire 20th century. And it remains one of the most streamed classic pop songs in the world, even in this century. Spector was 25 years old and on top of the world, widely acclaimed as the first true producer superstar. But the wall of sound was about to meet the oppressive walls of home. Even as Spector's professional life was gilded with hits, his personal life in the mid-1960s grew increasingly peculiar and dark. Fame and wealth exacerbated his insecurities and eccentricities. He affected a rather foppish fashion sense, sporting suits several sizes too large, and dark sunglasses indoors at all hours. Associates complained about his ever more unpredictable mood swings. And most notoriously, Phil had a growing fascination with firearms. He often carried a revolver in studio sessions, ostensibly to command respect or inject a bit of fear into proceedings. One might argue that a 5'5" man brandishing a gun in a room full of burly session players suggests overcompensation, a fact not lost on those who nicknamed him Harvey the Little Gunman behind his back. Amid this atmosphere, Spector's love life also took a fateful turn. In 1963, during the height of his hit-making, he became enamored with the raven-haired lead singer of the Ronettes, Ronnie Bennett. The feeling was mutual, at least at first. Ronnie was drawn to the quirky boy genius who was molding her voice into solid gold records. What she didn't know initially was that Phil was already married. He had married Annette Mirar, a singer from one of his less successful acts, which bore the slightly egotistical name of the Spectors 3. He had also named one of his record companies after her, but otherwise chose to keep the marriage very quiet. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the marriage to Annette was on the rocks in less than a couple of years, and he pursued Ronnie ardently. By 1965, he had divorced Mirar, and Ronnie moved into his 23-room mansion in Beverly Hills. In April 1968, Phil Spector married Ronnie Bennett in a quiet ceremony at Beverly Hills City Hall, and the producer, who had crafted so many love songs, seemingly had his own love story to celebrate. Behind the scenes, however, that story quickly devolved into a California Gothic nightmare. Phil's love for control knew no bounds, and once Ronnie became his wife, he set out to control every aspect of her existence. He stopped her from performing and effectively retired the Ronettes, insisting that one star in the family was more than enough. At their Beverly Hills home, Spector created a gilded cage for Ronnie, although even that might be romanticizing this nightmare. It was more like the world's glitziest concentration camp. He surrounded the estate with barbed wire and guard dogs, ostensibly for security, but really to prevent her from ever leaving. He confiscated her shoes so she couldn't walk out without literally cutting her feet. On the rare occasion he did allow her out for dinner, he forced Ronnie to drive alongside a life-size dummy of Spector placed in the passenger seat, a bizarre precaution to deter would-be admirers by giving the illusion he was always with her. Friends who visited noticed Ronnie's once bright spark was dimming. She seemed nervous, isolated, a prisoner in the house her husband's hit records had bought. Phil's behaviour toward Ronnie crossed into the grotesque. He taunted and terrified her with macabre gestures that were worthy of Edgar Allan Poe. Infamously, Phil installed a gold coffin with a glass top in the basement of their mansion, telling Ronnie that if she ever tried to leave him, he would kill her and display her corpse in that coffin. "I can keep my eye on you, even after you're dead," he sneered. By this point, in the late 1960s, Phil's psychological abuse had completely subjugated his young wife. She was living in constant fear. Ronnie later revealed she began drinking heavily and went to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, just to get out of the house for a while. Ronnie wasn't the only one who was suffering in the Beverly Hills mansion. That was pure fairy tale on the outside, but Dracula's castle within. The couple adopted a son, Dante, in 1969. And in a twisted attempt at playing Santa Claus a couple of years later, Phil surprised Ronnie at Christmas with adopted twin boys as presents. Parenting did little to soften his tyranny. If anything, having children only gave Phil new avenues for cruelty. Years later, his sons would allege horrifying abuse at their father's hands, saying he held them captive and even forced them into disturbing games, which involved simulating sex with adult women he had brought over. By 1972, Ronnie Spector had reached her breaking point. One night, barefoot and desperate, she fled their mansion with the help of her mother, running for her life, quite literally, from Phil Spector. "I knew that if I didn't leave, I was going to die there," Ronnie later said of her escape. In their 1974 divorce settlement, Ronnie gave up all future claim to Spector's record earnings and even surrendered custody of their children, terrified into submission by Phil's threats to have her killed if she didn't comply. She walked away with a used car and $25,000, a pittance compared to what her voice had helped him earn. But at least she had her life. The domestic horrors inside Spector's mansion would only fully come to light decades later. But even in the 1970s, rumors circulated in the music world that behind the genius facade, Phil Spector was a deeply disturbed man. By the 1970s, there were cracks forming in the wall of sound too. Tastes were changing and new production methods were bringing more complexity and depth to record production. The music landscape was shifting. British invasion bands and the rise of rock singer-songwriters meant the hit factory model was waning. In 1966, Spector had produced what he believed was his masterpiece, River Deep, Mountain High by Ike and Tina Turner. He poured an unprecedented amount of money and effort into the track, summoning his full wall of sound arsenal. Tina Turner delivered a scorching vocal over Spector's roaring orchestrations. He was certain it would be his grandest success. And in the UK, the song did hit the top 5, but to Phil's devastation, River Deep, Mountain High barely scraped the charts in America, peaking at a disappointing number 88. Aghast that his magnum opus had been underappreciated at home, Spector took it as a personal affront. He saw it as proof that the industry was out to get him, or at least that American listeners lacked taste, as he often claimed. In reality, the failure had more to do with changing trends and tastes. By the late 60s, there were teens buying records who were born after Elvis Presley's breakthrough, and they wanted fresh sounds, away from rock and roll and rhythm and blues. But Spector's ego was bruised badly. So, he retreated. In 1967, Spector closed down Phil Les Records, which by then had already lost some of its early momentum. He became, in his own word, a recluse, ducking out of the limelight almost entirely. He married Ronnie, as I mentioned, and focused on trying to build a normal life, though normalcy proved rather elusive, to say the least. For a while, Phil Spector simply vanished from the music scene that he had once dominated. In an industry that prizes staying hot, his withdrawal made him a mythic figure. Stories swirled of Spector puttering alone in his mansion, turning away visitors at the gate, collecting guns and rare cars while ignoring the rapidly evolving late 60s rock world outside. Then in 1969, an extraordinary opportunity lured Spector back to work. The Beatles, by then embroiled in internal conflicts, had abandoned the recording sessions for what was to be their final album, Let It Be. In early 1970, as the band neared breakup, John Lennon and George Harrison asked Phil Spector to step in and salvage the Let It Be tapes. It was certainly a testament to Spector's reputation that the world's most famous group handed him free rein to rework their swan song. Phil applied his bombastic touch. He added a heavenly choir and orchestral sweep to The Long and Winding Road, and layered other tracks with his trademark reverb and grandeur. The resulting Let It Be album, released in May 1970, gave the Beatles a final #1 hit, the title track, and won Phil acclaim for having expertly papered over the band's raw recordings. Not everyone was pleased though. Paul McCartney was livid at Spector's embellishments, especially on The Long and Winding Road. He felt the producer had drenched the song in schmaltz without his consent. Paul also took this as a personal affront, an attempt to diminish the pure simplicity and power of his work on this album, which is perhaps the finest McCartney album in the Beatles' catalogue. Years later, McCartney would put out a de-Spectorized remix called Let It Be Naked to strip away the layers. But at the time, Lennon defended Phil's work, quipping that the Beatles had invited him to dinner and that Spector gave the songs a proper coat of varnish. Phil's collaboration with the Beatles opened a new chapter for him in the early 1970s, and it involved working with rock royalty from Britain. He co-produced John Lennon's 1971 hit Instant Karma, which was famously recorded and mixed in a single day. He then co-produced Lennon's landmark solo album Imagine in 1971, including the iconic title track. With George Harrison, Phil co-produced the majestic triple album All Things Must Pass in 1970 and the star-studded benefit concert album The Concert for Bangladesh the following year, the latter earning Phil a share of the 1973 Grammy Award for Album of the Year. In these projects, Spector tempered his wall of sound approach, but his lush touches are unmistakable. You can hear it in everything from the soaring strings on Harrison's My Sweet Lord to the dense mix of choirs and bells on Lennon's Happy Xmas War Is Over. For a brief moment, Phil was back on top, adding his polish to generation-defining records once again. Yet even amid this Indian summer of his career, Phil was losing it in other parts of his life. He was drinking heavily and popping pills. His volatility in the studio, once merely eccentric, became downright dangerous. During the recording of Lennon's Rock and Roll Oldies project in Los Angeles in 1973, Phil's antics went off the rails. He would show up late to sessions, often in outrageous costumes. One night dressed as a surgeon, the next in a karate outfit, and always with a revolver strapped to his hip. At one infamous session, a drunken Phil fired a gun into the studio ceiling just inches from John Lennon's ear. Lennon, furious and half-deafened, shouted, "Phil, if you're gonna kill me, kill me. But don't fuck with my ears, I need 'em." In another incident, Phil chased Lennon through the studio's halls with a gun, ranting threats. The chaos eventually ended the project. Spector disappeared with the session tapes, forcing Lennon's label to pay $90,000 to retrieve them so the album could be completed without him. "I'm fond of his work," Lennon Riley reflected later about Spector, "but his personality, I'm not crazy about." Phil's erratic, violent behaviour wasn't reserved just for superstar Scousers. He terrified plenty of others too. In 1975, during sessions for Cher, he allegedly pointed a loaded gun at her. She had come to record backing vocals until she fled the studio in fear. Leonard Cohen, the poet-songwriter, suffered through a Spector production in 1977 for his underappreciated album Death of a Ladies' Man. The idea to work together came about under somewhat inauspicious circumstances. The two men were introduced by their shared lawyer. Cohen, who was also in a career lull at this time, decided to accept Phil's invitation to visit his home and talk about making a record together. He'd been warned by almost everyone he met, including Johnny Mitchell, that Spector was not only balmy, but potentially dangerous. Cohen wasn't intimidated, though. Once arrived, Phil locked the doors and made it clear Leonard wouldn't be leaving until Phil decided it was time. "Ever understated," Cohen said, "as long as we are locked up, we might as well write some songs together." Apparently, the two hit it off surprisingly well, although Cohen had to adjust to Phil's insistence of having the air conditioning set to 32 degrees Fahrenheit round the clock. Once Cohen got hold of an overcoat to keep the icicles off, they set to work and bonded. But the Phil Spector that was happy at home with an instrument in his hand was a different beast to the one that emerged as soon as he stepped into a music studio, where he reverted to tyranny. One night, Phil clutched Cohen in a bear hug, jammed a pistol into his neck, and declared, "I love you, Leonard," to which Cohen, a man accustomed to passing dark emotions with humour, gently replied, "I hope you do, Phil." Looking back, Cohen said, "It was one of those periods when my chops were impaired, and I wasn't in the right kind of condition to resist Phil's very strong influence on an eventual takeover of the record." There were lots of guns around in the studio and lots of liquor, a somewhat dangerous atmosphere. He had bodyguards who were heavily armed also. He liked guns. I like guns too, but I generally don't carry one. And it's hard to ignore a .45 lying on the console. When I was working with him alone, it was very agreeable. But the more people in the room, the wilder Phil would get. I couldn't help but admire the extravagance of his performance, but at the time, couldn't really hold my own. The resulting album was a muddled wall of excess, and Cohen's vocals were buried under Spector's over-the-top production. Critics panned it, and Cohen never worked with him again, although it is one I am rather partial to myself. Have a listen to the track Memories, which is probably the finest moment on the album and shows the best of both of these two quite extraordinary talents. Perhaps most emblematic of Phil's Jekyll and Hyde reputation in that era was his collaboration with punk pioneers the Ramones in 1979. The pairing was bizarre. The Ramones' raw three-chord rock seemed the antithesis of Spector's intricate layering, but the band hoped Spector could deliver them a commercial breakthrough. Instead, they got a hostage situation. One moment he was affable, cracking corny jokes. The next he was stalking the control room in a cape and sunglasses, barking orders and wielding his .38 revolver. One night, after interminable takes of a guitar riff, bassist D.D. Ramone had enough and tried to leave. Spector allegedly whipped out his gun and blocked the exit. "You're not going anywhere," he growled. D.D., street-hardened and unimpressed, responded, "What are you gonna do, shoot me? Go ahead, I'm leaving." D.D. explained what happened next. He leveled his gun at my heart and then motioned for me and the rest of the band to get back in the piano room. He only holstered his pistol when he felt secure that his bodyguards could take over. Then he sat down at his black concert piano and made us listen to him play and sing Baby, I Love You until well after 4:30 in the morning. The Ramones eventually finished the album, End of the Century, under Spector's obsessive and costly watch. He endlessly remixed tracks and drove the budget to unheard-of levels for a punk record. The record cost more than $200,000 to make, absolutely dwarfing their previous albums, which all had cost less than $10,000. When it finally came out in 1980, End of the Century got mixed reviews. Some fans loved the beefed-up sound, others felt Spector had sanded down the Ramones' rough edges. Joey Ramone dismissed it by saying, "I think that some of the worst crap I ever wrote went on the album. That was me at my worst." Commercially, it didn't make the Ramones the radio stars Spector had promised. It would, however, be Phil Spector's last major production for decades. By the dawn of the 1980s, at just 40 years old, Spector had managed to alienate so much of the music world that he had no one left who was willing to work with him. He'd even scared off the Ramones. His genius had given way to an unpredictable and chaotic atmosphere of menace. After the Ramones episode, Phil once again vanished from public view, this time for the better part of 2 decades. He made an aborted attempt to work with Celine Dion in the early 90s and produced a few obscure tracks here and there. But for most of the 1980s and 1990s, Phil was a hermit-like figure, a rock and roll Howard Hughes, holed up in his mansion. He would target practice with his pistols inside the house. He became notorious for wearing outlandish wigs, gigantic fluffy helmet-like hairpieces that faintly resembled the episode where the Pink Panther gets stuck in a clothes dryer. These wigs were possibly to cover not only his bald bunts, but also scars from a near-fatal car crash in 1974, when he'd been thrown through a windscreen and required hundreds of stitches to his head. The accident had left him with serious injuries and, it was said, a renewed fear of mortality. Friends noticed that Phil's already erratic behavior worsened after his recovery. He grew more reclusive, more prone to dark moods and substance abuse. In 1982, Spector fathered twin children with a new girlfriend, Janice Zavala, a daughter, Nicole, and a son, Philip Jr. But tragedy struck again when Philip Jr. died of leukemia at age 9 in 1991. The loss reportedly plunged Phil further into depression and chemical dependency. For someone who had once commanded studios full of people, Spector now often found himself alone with his demons. He occasionally surfaced at industry events, but more often he made news for the wrong reasons. In 1988, Ronnie Spector and the Ronettes sued him for unpaid royalties and rights to their music, a legal battle that dragged on for years. When a verdict finally came in 1998, the court ordered Spector to pay Ronnie her share of royalties, but upheld his ownership of the recordings. Spector, ever vindictive, seemed to relish that Ronnie didn't get everything she sought. A small, spiteful victory in his otherwise empty twilight years. By the early 2000s, Phil Spector was seen as an almost mythical recluse. Now a grey eccentric roaming around his decaying mansion, stuffed with memorabilia and guns. Despite the long absence from music, Spector hadn't entirely given up on a comeback. In the early 2000s, he had started working with a few artists again, notably a British band called Star Sailor and a singer named Hargo, trying to reignite the old studio magic. But his reputation preceded him. One member of Star Sailor described visiting Spector's mansion for a session and being met by the sight of revolvers casually strewn on the coffee table and a diminutive host whose hair was so enormous it looked, quote, like an Oompa Loompa crossed with Mozart. Sessions would be cancelled last minute or run bizarrely late into the night. It was clear the old Spector magic came now with a heavy dose of madness. In September 2006, at age 66, and while out on bail awaiting trial for murder, Spector even found the time to get married one more time. He wed Rochelle Short, a 26-year-old aspiring singer, in a quick courthouse ceremony. Ever the optimist, Spector perhaps assumed he'd beat the charges and resume some semblance of life. But this marriage, like his others, would not last. He filed for divorce a decade later, in 2016, from behind bars. It seemed even incarceration did not mellow his habit of impulsive, doomed romances. And as for those prison bars, it's time I got into the really mad part of the story, the Lana Clarkson murder trial. Everything truly unraveled for Phil on that fateful winter night in 2003. The setting was his mansion in Alhambra, California, the grand faux castle he called Pyrenees Castle, complete with a turret and a medieval aesthetic, utterly fitting for the fairy tale turned horror story that was his life. On the night of February 2nd, 2003, Spector went out alone to Hollywood's House of Blues, one of his occasional forays into the nightlife he had mostly abandoned. There in the VIP area, he met Lana Clarkson, a 40-year-old actress and hostess. Clarkson was statuesque, blonde, and best known for campy 80s B-movies. Working the door that night, she initially didn't recognize the diminutive older man with wild air as Phil Spector. But Phil, always garrulous and likely intoxicated, charmed her into conversation and eventually invited her out for a drink after her shift. Perhaps starstruck or just curious, Clarkson agreed. In the early hours of February 3rd, 2003, Lana Clarkson rode with Spector in his chauffeured Mercedes limo back to his mansion. She'd never be seen alive again. Spector's driver, waiting outside, later recounted hearing snatches of argument and a gunshot from within the house at around 5 a.m. Moments later, Spector emerged onto the back porch, a pistol in his hand, looking stunned. Inside, the scene was grisly. Clarkson's body was found, slumped in a chair in the marble foyer, her broken teeth scattered on the floor, a single gunshot wound through the roof of her mouth. The Colt Cobra revolver that had fired the fatal shot lay at her feet. Spector's hands were smeared with blood. When police arrived, Phil was behaving oddly, alternately claiming it was an accident and refusing to exit the house. Eventually he surrendered, was handcuffed, and taken into custody. From the outset, Phil denied murdering Clarkson. He told authorities, and later journalists, a version of events in which Lana, quote, kissed the gun, suggesting that she, for unknown reasons, had pulled the trigger herself in some suicidal gesture while in his home. It was a story as strange as it was self-serving, and investigators treated it with skepticism. As evidence was gathered, a pattern began to emerge. Numerous women who had encountered Spector over the years came forward with eerily similar stories. He'd invite a woman to his home or hotel, drink heavily, make advances. If rejected or if the woman tried to leave, he'd produce a firearm and menace her, sometimes forcing her to stay until dawn. The prosecution would later present 4 such women who testified that Spector had pulled a gun on them in the past under almost identical circumstances. In these earlier incidents, thankfully, no one had been shot. But Lana Clarkson, it seemed, had the tragic misfortune of being the one who didn't get away. It took 4 years for Spector to face trial, during which time he remained free on a $1 million bond. Those years were surreal. Spector, the aging producer turned accused killer, became a tabloid curiosity. At pre-trial hearings, he appeared in his now expanded variety of flamboyant wigs. One day, a blonde page boy, another day, a huge brunette bouffant, and garish outfits that scream for attention, if not exactly designed to win sympathy. With his tiny frame and strange attire, he looked like a haunted circus ringmaster. This bizarre presentation whether born of vanity or mental instability, did him no favors in the court of public opinion. By the time People vs. Philip Spector began in Los Angeles in March 2007, the media circus was off the charts. Cameras swarmed outside the courthouse, court TV carried gavel-to-gavel coverage, and curious viewers tuned in to watch the Wall of Sound maestro finally face the music. The first trial in 2007 was dramatic but ended inconclusively. Prosecutors laid out their case. Lana Clarkson had been shot either in a fit of anger or during a drunken game, and Spector was the only one wielding the gun. The defense, led by celebrity attorney Bruce Cutler of John Gotti fame, and later a team including Linda Kenny Baden, proposed alternate theories, including that Clarkson, despondent over a flagging career, might indeed have impulsively shot herself. The forensic evidence was hotly debated. Notably, Spector's fingerprints were not found on the gun, and he wasn't found with blood spatter on him, which his lawyers seized upon as suggesting he wasn't close to the victim when the shot was fired. But the parade of women testifying to Spector's gunplay severely undermined his accident narrative. After months of testimony, the jury was deadlocked 10-2 in favor of convicting Spector. The judge declared a mistrial. Phil walked out of court still a free man, but the DA immediately announced a retrial. By the second trial in 2008 to 2009, the public had largely made up its mind about Phil Spector. He had become at once a punchline and a pariah. Even the usually demure New Yorker couldn't resist describing him as a minuscule popsicle of a man wielding a revolver. For the retrial, Spector swapped out his defense team and toned down his look. The fright wigs were retired in favor of a simple if obvious toupee. The trial was less flashy the second time around, but the evidence hadn't changed. On April 13, 2009, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. Spector, at 69 years old, stood stone-faced as he was remanded in the handcuffs. A month later, he was sentenced to 19 years to life in state prison, effectively a life sentence for a near septuagenarian. For Lana Clarkson's family, it was vindication that her killer would not evade justice. For Phil Spector, it was the final act in a long, slow self-destruction. Incarceration at the California State Prison in Corcoran initially did not completely silence Phil Spector, not immediately at least. Ever the manipulator, he gave a few jailhouse interviews through intermediaries, maintaining his innocence and complaining about his health. His third wife, Rochelle, campaigned publicly that Spector was a frail old man wrongly punished. She claimed he was suffering from ailments ranging from pneumonia to losing his ability to speak, rather ironic given how verbose he was while inside. Indeed, prison records later showed Spector's health deteriorated sharply after 2010. In 2013, he was transferred to a prison hospital facility in Stockton, California, as his condition worsened. Photos released by the Department of Corrections showed a shaven-headed Spector, toothless and thin, looking nothing like the nutty impresario of the 1960s. The transformation was jarring but not unexpected. Time and punishment had caught up with him. As the years went by, Phil faded from the headlines. Now and then, he'd emerge as a grim reference in discussions about artists who had committed crimes, often paired with the likes of other disgraced stars. Phil himself, however, had little contact with the outside world beyond occasional visits from family once media interest in his conviction waned. In 2016, he and Rochelle finally divorced. She had begun pursuing reality TV opportunities and music projects of her own, and Spector cut her off, accusing her of squandering his fortune. It was a tabloid footnote that hardly registered. The Phil Spector of 2016 was a largely forgotten figure. In late 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept through California's prisons, and Phil, elderly and in generally poor health, was not spared. In December 2020, he was diagnosed with COVID-19 and transferred to an outside hospital on New Year's Eve as his lungs failed. He hung on for a couple more weeks, but on January 16, 2021, Phil Spector died at age 81 while still in custody. The official cause of death was listed as complications from COVID-19, compounded by other underlying conditions. He had served 11 years of his 19-to-life term. Notably, he would have been eligible to petition for parole in 2024, a hearing he did not live to see. News of Spector's death prompted a flurry of reckonings in the press. Music publications sometimes gingerly grappled with how to acknowledge his towering contributions to pop music in light of his crimes. Rolling Stone magazine initially ran an obituary that soft-pedaled his murder conviction, saying his life had been upended by the charges. After backlash, they amended it to state plainly that he was a convicted killer. The New York Times also ran with a report that his legacy was, quote, marred by the murder conviction. The internet pounced to remind the Times that a murder isn't a mere smudge on an otherwise fine legacy. It eclipses it. The age-old argument of whether you can separate the art from the artist trundles on. The Guardian noted dryly that Spector brought joy to pop music and misery to so many lives. Public reactions from artists were similarly conflicted. Some, like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who had idolized Spector's work, praised his musical genius in tweets, but avoided mentioning the crime. Others, like Ronnie Spector, who had lived through his nightmare firsthand, went with a tone of relief. "He's finally out of here," Ronnie wrote upon her ex-husband's death, while still acknowledging what she called the beautiful era of music he created. To his credit, Phil was capable of moments of lucidity and self-reflection, a fact that understandably gets lost in the madness of his actions. In 2005, he testified in a court deposition that he had been treated for bipolar disorder for almost a decade. He said no sleep, depression, mood changes, mood swings, hard to live with, hard to concentrate, just hard, a hard time getting through life. "I've been called a genius, and I think a genius is not there all the time and has borderline insanity." Phil Spector's life presents a tricky challenge: how to remember a man who contributed so much to the art of popular music, yet caused so much harm interpersonally. On one hand, his influence is massive. The Wall of Sound revolutionized studio production. His DNA can be heard in everything from the Beach Boys' layered harmonies on Pet Sounds to Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run and the operatic sweep of Meat Loaf's Bat Out of Hell. Modern producers like Brian Eno, Trevor Horn, and Jack Antonoff have cited Spector's work as foundational. Spector's techniques, recording multiple instruments in unison, using echo chambers as instruments in themselves, have become standard practice. His hits remain foundational texts of pop. Be My Baby still regularly tops lists of the greatest songs ever recorded. Each December, radios come alive with the Spector-produced A Christmas Gift for You album, a perennial holiday favourite. In the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum, where Spector was inducted in 1989, an entire exhibit is dedicated to his groundbreaking studio wizardry and the artists he produced. Simply put, you cannot tell the story of pop music without Phil Spector's chapter, and yet you cannot tell Phil Spector's story without the gun, the violence, and the tragedy of Lana Clarkson. His legacy is a cautionary tale about idolizing creative genius without scrutinizing personal conduct. Long before the murder, Spector's peers in the industry knew he was troubled. But there was a tendency to shrug off or even chuckle at his gun-toting eccentricities as the price of genius. In hindsight, the warning signs were written in neon. The image of Phil holding a pistol to John Lennon's head in a studio, kidnapping the Ramones, or of him manically locking his wife in a mansion, are not just scandalous anecdotes. They were harbingers of an inevitable catastrophe if left unchecked. The Clarkson murder forced a reckoning. Brilliant or not, Spector was a man capable of monstrous acts. and he had to face consequences like anyone else. His fall from grace also mirrored a broader cultural shift. The internet community led recognition in the 21st century that great art does not excuse atrocious behavior. In the end, Phil Spector died in a prison hospital. There was no grand final act, no redemption tour, no tearful confession or apology. True to form, Spector maintained his innocence to the end, leaving the world as defiantly and enigmatically as he lived in it. He left behind twin legacies: the music that will thrill and comfort generations to come, and the cautionary example of how talent and power can be twisted by unchecked mental illness, substance abuse, and violence. Perhaps the most Spector-esque coda of all came after his death. In the days that followed, streams and sales of songs he produced actually spiked. It was as if people wanted to separate the art from the artist one last time and just enjoy the songs, if they could. But the very next week, HBO released a new documentary about the Clarkson case, featuring interviews with many who knew Spector. The two dueling images, Spector the pop genius versus Spector the crazed gunman, flickered across the culture in quick succession, reminding everyone that the story was never simple. Phil Spector once dreamed of creating a sonic utopia for youth, a Wagnerian approach to rock and roll, as he called it. And in large part, he did just that. He built his wall of sound so high and mighty that it still stands in music history. But ultimately, he could not escape the walls of his own making, the walls of paranoia around his mansion, the walls of a prison, and the walls within his mind. His life was a symphony of highs and lows, a pop opera with a tragic final act. And as the world will forever remember, the echo of Phil Spector's actions, for better and for worse, will reverberate far longer than any 2-minute pop song ever could. Well, I must admit I was looking forward to making this one. Whatever you think of Phil Spector, it's one hell of a story. Why not leave me a comment and give me your opinion, or just tell me your favourite Spector track? I'd also be very glad of any likes or shares of the video. And of course, please subscribe if you haven't already, it helps out enormously. Finally, I do now have a YouTube members area you can join by clicking the join button underneath the video. There are custom rock and roll themed emojis, early access, and even exclusive extra mini episodes for the top tiers. Thanks, the help is really quite marvellous. I've been Chester, see you next week.